Alice, he named her, after that first little sound she had made, that sigh or whimper which changed Balvan's life forever. Her body resembled an 8 to 10-year-old human girl, but as a brand new life, she had to be taught everything, from words to the 3 worlds in which they lived. Balvan devoted himself to showing her everything he could, and Zonda helped whenever she was around, though the 2 spirits had very different ideas of what to teach the child. Balvan showed Alice the stones and the tunnels, the low sky of his world, and he taught her about the creatures of the Underdark. Blind things with hooks for hands, predators that can lurk many years between meals, waiting for something to wander in front of them, and great acidic beasts which tunneled endlessly through earth and stone, such that the paths, danger zones, and safe havens all changed over time. He told her how, at the peak of the Spider Empire, the Drow employed countless scouts and spies just to maintain their maps of the ever-shifting Underdark. Zonda taught Alice the birds, insects, and flowers of the other 2 worlds, and taught her about other spirits, like the mischievous fox, the beautiful but dangerous fire, and the 4-winged hunter, the dragonfly. She explained to the child the mortal's circle of life, to be born and die, to eat and be eaten, and how they could love but also hate. But the wind spirit could only point out the clouds of the endless sky from the ground, since, like her father, the stone child could not fly. Alice was curious and learned quickly. She had skin of stone, hair of wind, and eyes of wonder. She could be solemn as Balvan, or excitable as Zonda, depending on her mood, and she was much loved, but she was not strong. Most mortal children are born weak, if not helpless, whereas the stone child came into the world fully formed, though not full-grown. She was able to walk, dance, and play from the beginning, and she learned to speak so easily compared to human, elven, or Nezumi children at least. But she was not strong like Balvan, nor agile like Zonda. In fact, from the day she was born, she seemed to be getting weaker. It was hard for her to climb the mountain to visit the Church of Pelor, and it became harder. When trying to help in the garden, she found the soil and water heavy, and it became heavier. By the end of her first year, she was always tired, and Balvan took to carrying her everywhere on his great shoulders. She loved the ride, loved the higher point of view, loved when Zonda whipped around them quickly, kicking up both of their hair, and she would hug Daddy's head, give him sweet little kisses when he said something funny, whether or not the humor was intended. But she continued to grow weaker. Spirits cannot die as mortals do. Zonda had seen animal spirits who were eaten, their bodies consumed. They continued to exist in the astral sea, but diminished to the point that they were barely there. They had no power to take part in the world. And she could see Alice fading as though the child were slowly heading toward that point. Balvan and Zonda gathered the other spirits who lived at the mountain to seek their counsel. Shotirui, the dragonfly, said,
"Some spirits become stronger by eating the bodies of other spirits. Maybe she could eat dragonfly,"
smirked Orange Ears, earning some angry buzzing from the 4-winged predator. Vohoin, the fire spirit, said,
"One winter I was cooling down, and I couldn't melt the ice to reach the wood of fallen trees. So I called out to an Ifrit from the city of brass and made a pact."
"A pact?" asked Zonda.
"I agreed to be bound to the Ifrit's service and to do a task for them, and in return, they saved me and granted me some of their own spark, so I can keep burning, at least a little, even without wood."
"Maybe you could try burning, Alice,"
grinned Orange Ears, who then had to leap and dance away to avoid an irritated, if half-hearted, attempt by the fire spirit to ignite the fox's tails. "But why is she getting sicker?" asked Balvan. The dragonfly and the fire spirit both shrugged, but Orange Ears said,
"You won't find answers from fools like us. You need real wisdom."
And with that the fox ran off, their tails disappearing down the tunnel to the fey side of the Garden of Three Skies, and they were gone. Orange Ears was away for many days, but when the fox returned, their tails were wagging.
She's here! Come on! You gotta come down the mountain!
Balvan and Zonda were confused, but the fox insisted they bring Alice to the fey forest near the base of the mountain. And so they descended the slope, Alice riding her father's shoulders, piggyback. A few feet from the base, the stone spirit paused, for he had rarely stepped further than the mountain that was him, beyond the base of his strength. And though Orange Ears was a friend, the fox was always playing tricks, never seeming to intend real harm, but on a few occasions the results had proven dangerous for the mortal people of the mountain. But thinking of Alice and her declining state, Balvan took the next step, and the one after. Flanked by the fox and wind spirits, he carried Alice to the forest of tall, thin trees several hundred feet from the mountain in the sky world. He felt weak so far from the mountain, though he still easily bore the stone child's weight on his shoulders. As soon as they stepped past the outer line of trees, they found before them a great fox, curled into a sleepy ball 20 feet across, with many tails poking out from underneath, like a large litter of fox pups nursing. But as the dark slits of her eyes opened slightly to look upon the visitors, she began to rise, her sinuous body uncoiling almost snake-like and fanning out her tails, not separate foxes, not even several three-tailed pups like Orange Ears, but all the tails poking out from beneath her had been merely the white tips of her own great peacock fan of 9 tails. Orange Ears bowed deeply, fanning their own 3 fluffy tails out behind them, though the display was but a pale imitation of the great fox. Even Zonda hung back in reverence, though her instinct was clearly to whoosh around and ruffle the fur and look at every part of the majestic spirit. Balvan stood solemnly, but Alice on his shoulders let out a delighted gasp. "Ah!" "Thank you for coming," started Balvan, but he was interrupted by a soft, deep, enthralling voice. "I answer no one's call. I just happen to be here. Remember, you came to me for my wisdom." The words were stern, but there was a mischievous twinkle in her eye which softened them, as though letting them in on a joke. Orange Ears interjected, fawningly.
"Mother Fox is definitely the wisest. Who else could trick a giant into shrinking down small enough to eat him?"
The huge fox gave the lesser one an appreciative little nod. "Now, since I just happen to be here, tell me, what wisdom do you seek from Mother Fox?" "My daughter, Alice." Balvan reached up, hoisting her up and over his head, as she held her arms straight out to either side, grinning. But he had barely started speaking when he was interrupted. "The stone child, yes. I can see that she is not well." Mother Fox's voice sounded suspiciously, almost mockingly, all-knowing, and Orange Ears nodded vigorously, looking back at Zonda and Balvan as though to say, You see? Balvan finished lowering Alice down to the ground in front of him with his great hands in her armpits, trying to set her gently upon her feet, but her legs were so shaky that she seemed unable to hold herself up. After gingerly trying 3 times to release her arms and each time having to immediately catch her again, he finally set her all the way down into a sitting position. Alice didn't seem bothered by this at all, so focused was she on the huge, pretty fox, but Zonda wobbled side to side worriedly, and even stone-faced Balvan looked sad that his daughter could no longer stand. Mother Fox's smirking expression turned more serious, as she moved her face close to Alice. The wise spirit's great, black, round eyes now fully open and focused on the gray, long-haired girl. Alice stretched forward, trying to touch the orange snout just out of reach of her wiggling fingers, and after 2 very long seconds, the fox moved a little closer, letting the stone child feel her face. "She's so soft, fluffy." Alice grinned ear to ear as her tiny hands caressed the snout, whose mouth was large enough to easily swallow her whole. But Mother Fox's smile was curled by sadness. "You are a sweet child," she said, but though her mouth stopped moving, the wise spirit's voice continued to speak within Balvan's head, and from a glance at Zonda's expression, she too could hear it. "This child is beautiful, But now I see that she is not made to last. She is the child of earth and wind. The sparks from each of you together were enough to bring her life, but it cannot last, because your natures are opposite. Her heart is tearing itself apart. "No!" Zonda said aloud, and Alice turned to see what made the wind spirit sound so sad and alarmed. Looking in her eyes, Zonda blurted out, "I'm sorry! I'm so sorry!" And she soared up and away with a speed and ferocity that made all grass and fur in the clearing flutter, including Balvan's heavy strands of hair. Alice looked back up at her father, confused, and he looked down at her for a moment, stunned, before kneeling down to embrace her. He lifted one of her hands back up to Mother Fox's fluffy face, distracting his child while he was deep in thought. "Soft," Alice said, content again as only a young child could be, while Balvan met the fox's great, black, round eyes. Returning to the garden, Balvan left Alice in Znanya's care and went to look for Zonya. Predictably, he found her near the fey peak of the mountain, where she used to talk to Palor so long ago. She floated in a sitting position, with her windy skirt pulled up to her chest. She bobbed slowly around in a small circle. As Balvan approached, she turned away, trailing salty mist. "Zonda?" "I'm so sorry," she cried softly. "I was just trying to help. I didn't know." "You did help," said Balvan. "Without you, Alice was not alive. I was holding only a rock." "I should have asked someone else. Fire or Fox. It was too different," she moaned quietly. But Balvan laid his hand on her shoulder, stopping her slow rotation, and she looked up at him, drenched with sad humidity. "You sacrificed a piece of yourself for my dream. Who else would have done that? And whatever we may look like, whatever the foxes say, I feel more similar to you than to anyone else. That is why I tried to give Alice hair like yours." He embraced the wind spirit, and she gripped him as tightly as her slippery, shifting arms could. "I still feel like it's my fault." "No more than mine," he said sternly, "and I don't want to lose her." "Neither do I." "Then let us find a way to save her." They decided to take turns so one of them could stay with Alice. Because she felt so guilty, Balvan let Zonda try first. The wind spirit soared up, past the trees, through the clouds, a great distance upwards, higher than even the giant winged rocks can fly, until she began to face resistance. For Zonda was a wind of the earth, and the grandeur of the fey sky was without limit. But as she reached the top, the soft boundary where she could fly no higher, she was greeted by her friend Vilivith, who she had called out to in the astral sea. Each of them was a faint form, visible only as motion, but where Zonda's shape resembled a triangular skirt, Vilivith's hair and body trailed off into several long ribbons. Zonda could fly no higher on her own, but her friend was a wind from this higher stratum, at home at such altitudes, and together they ascended even higher. Hours it took for Zonda to reach this layer, which some called the inner sky. Days it took for her and Vilivith to traverse this much vaster space, passing around and through weather systems which dwarfed the most tumultuous tempests ever seen in the Fadelands. Oceans of precipitation rained down from one cloud to another, never reaching the earthly skies of Zonda's home. But the two wind spirits continued undaunted until the air began to change again as they reached the wide sky.
"Someone here must know how to heal a half-wind spirit,"
said Zonda with forced confidence.
"I called for my friend Awan," assured Vilivith. "They have the sight, but I don't know how far away they were."
Guided by the astral, the pair headed in the direction from which Awan was coming, flying far from the great clouds of the stratum below, though by this point the ordinarily fast and agile Zonda was reduced to a mere passenger, unable even to hover without her friend's zephyric power, as they approached small dots hanging in the wide sky. The dots grew and grew into an archipelago of strange floating islands. As they passed closer, the islands turned out to be living things, or the remains thereof, like great clumps of roots, or coral reefs, or fungal masses, maybe some of each. And even here, there were mortals eking out a living amidst the unearthly winds. The two spirits traveled on until they saw a great ghostly shape moving towards them, like an immense flying whale made entirely of the stuff of clouds, with no visible eyes, just as the tiny, translucent figures of the two winds had only vague indentations for eyes. "Awan!" called Vilivith. The cloud whales slowly opened their maw, a dark void large enough to swallow the mountain sideways, and they swam through the sky beneath the two spirits, collecting the innate magical energy of the Fey sky. A few of those countless invisible particles sparking little bolts of lightning as they passed near Awan's triangular cloud teeth.
"Welcome, little gusts," said Awan's voice in their minds. "So you are Vilivith's friend. Where is the stone child?"
"I will show you," said Zonda, and in the astral sea, where distance meant nothing, she guided Awan to Alice. Like her father, Alice was unable to see the plane of spirits, which always made Zonda sad, but the child glowed so brightly in the astral, and the great whale, who felt much smaller here, no larger than the two wind spirits, looked over her intently.
"I see," was all Awan said.
"What do you see? Surely your sight can find an answer," prompted Vilivith. "Vilivith said Windsight is outside of time. Can you see her future? How can we save her?" begged Zonda, desperate for some hope. Awan sighed a deep, reverberating feeling into their minds.
"She is only partly a child of wind, and Windsight rarely extends more than a few moments into the future. But I can tell that this child and her divided heart cannot continue as she is. She must either change or pass into the astral forever. Or," Awan sounded distant, "perhaps both."
But can a spirit return here if they cannot see this world?" Zonda looked at Alice's astral form, as she so often had, as she had so often looked at Balvan, thinking of this same question in terrible fear of the answer.
"Of course they can,"
said Awan, with vast, gentle confidence.
"They are spirits. In the case of one like this child, it is their form, their body, that prevents them from seeing beyond the worlds of the solid. But there will come a time when they abandon that existence and return home. One day they will lose that life, but they will regain this one."
Zonda was so happy to be thus reassured that she could not react for a moment, but her friend pushed for her. "How do we help her now, though?"
"That,"
said the cloud whale's astral form,
"I cannot see."
Zonda and Vilivith thanked the spirit once more, as the immense whale soared on underneath them. From directly above, Awan looked like just another endless cloud rippling past, until the shape narrowed, just before broadening again into the massive flat tail, which swept slowly from up to down. Vilivith looked sadly at Zonda. "I don't know who else could help. Awan is the biggest spirit I know." "He is very big," agreed Zonda, dejected. They spent many more days up there, soaring to the top of the wide sky in search of other spirits who might help. So high the air turned hollow, and even Vilivith could no longer gain altitude. And when Zonda returned to the mountain, Balvan was waiting. No words were required as they embraced. Just seeing her, he would have known if she had found anything, any hope, and his strong arms told her there was no blame. Or rather, he did not blame her, though she still blamed herself. Zonda stayed with Alice, where she sat in the garden as Balvan took his turn. He crossed over to the Shadowfell, that world of shallow sky, and headed down once more into the tunnels they called the Underdark. Down the roots of the mountain he traveled, deep and fast and far as he had once before, but now with purpose, and now remembering the branchings in the stone of the mountain that was his strength. Past the depths of the Drow, past the base of the underground sea, he glided, a dark form passing through the stone. If anything felt his presence, felt his sense of mission, they chose not to interfere. Balvan reached the depths at which he had met the stone dragon, and could see her endless art written throughout the rock in complex density patterns, invisible to nearly anyone but the two of them. But though he had in his heart wished to talk to Nemetov again, he hadn't really expected to find her here, and had no intention of seeking out and bothering the solitary dragon. He would forever be thankful for what she had shared with him, and could ask no more from her. So he continued down. Balvan thought his best chance to save Alice would be to find the power which had saved the fire spirit who lived on the mountain. From what Vohoin had described, an Ifrit had granted them part of their spark of life in some sort of pact. The fire spirit, due to their nature, had been able to call out directly to an Ifrit through the astral plane. But Vohoin said that the pact they had made to save themselves prevented them from contacting the City of Brass again, except to heed their patron's call. And though Zonda could see and move through the astral sea, there were places she couldn't go, and the sanctum of the Ifriti was one, because the true City of Brass, the physical place, was hidden down below the surface of the worlds, or at least Balvan's world. So he continued down, further than he had ever gone before, but the thin vein of stone from his mountain was dwindling rapidly. Soon it came to an end, and he could go no further. He stood at the bottom of the mountain, surrounded by stone that was not his, and the world continued ever downward. Alice. He could go further. It was only fear that held him back. Nothing prevented him from stepping beyond the strength, the safety of the mountain. He tried to harden his stone breastplate, but he had done so 100 times, and it was already as dense as his power could make it, as was the stone shield he had made to fight Zoloto. For Alice, Balvan took the next step, and the one after. Down and down he journeyed, through a world of strange stone unfamiliar to him. No more signs of Nemetov's works, no more creatures that he knew. Water had already been very rare, so far beneath the underground sea. But the things which lived down here had no use for water. Most had no doubt never seen it. Instead, Balvan had to work around rivers of slow-flowing, semi-liquid metals, which dripped and pooled amid the hotter and hotter rock as he descended. Even from a few 100 feet below the surface, the stone had always grown warmer the deeper he went. But now, for the first time, it began to affect him. An oppressive heat surrounding him as he glided through the rocks and tried to avoid the molten parts, burning his arms in more than one place, because his senses were not as good here. Soon he could see only a few feet through the stone, and so he began looking for tunnels and fissures, emerging from the concealing walls to climb down in the open, exposed to creatures that hunted by scent, or by motion, or by the dark sight, which required no light. As Balvan walked the endless sweltering tunnels, searching for paths further down, he sensed movement in the walls, barely an instant before teeth were upon him. A creature with 3 arms evenly spaced around its large maw, phased out of the stone, much as Balvan himself normally did. It grabbed his right arm, his face, his left side. Its great circle of teeth bit into spots in his arm, shoulder, anywhere they could get around his breastplate. And he could feel it trying to eat or even to phase through that armor, but the creature couldn't quite push through the tremendous, almost elemental hardness Balvan had created. He tried to tear it off him and to strike it, but separated from the roots of the mountain, his strength was much less than he was used to. A punch which should have launched the beast into the wall landed with a mere thud, and they were locked in a brutal struggle, a vicious embrace of muscle and teeth and rock. Finally, Balvan managed to strike the thing in one of its 3 eyes, and the creature appeared to decide the meal wasn't worth the effort, releasing him with a violent shove and disappearing back into the stone behind it. The mountain spirit's stone sight was still not working well down here, but he could feel the creature lurking, and he punched it one more time, phasing his fist through the tunnel wall to show that it wasn't safe there. In reaction, the creature faded back further into the deep hot stone, beyond what Balvan could see. He punched the solid wall of the tunnel itself one last time, not phasing through, but letting his fist strike the surface with a resounding force that echoed up and down the space. Then he shambled on, nursing his wounds. Balvan had a number of cuts and gouges from those teeth, and his knuckles were scraped raw from hitting the creature's sharp rocky carapace again and again. Very rarely had he been injured so, because he had rarely left the mountain where he was strong. And he was afraid the heat would continue growing, afraid of more strange beasts now that his senses were dulled and his strength diminished. But he set aside those fears. Not all of them, but enough to continue on, because they were nothing compared to his fear of losing Alice. He continued working his way down, now wary of ambush from the walls, and there were more attacks by the same and other strange creatures over several days. Then Balvan saw a light accompanied by clinking sounds of metal on stone. In these almost immeasurable depths, light was exceedingly rare, and usually a trap. But it had been days, it had been more than 100 kilometers since he had seen any kind of illumination. And given the choice between light and more darkness, even in his worn and battered, weakened state, he moved toward what was probably a trap. As he approached, the heat grew intense until he reached a great crack in the wall. Through that fissure, many feet below him, he saw a great yellow-white river of magma. There, almost silhouetted against the molten flow, he saw several strange creatures, dwarf-like, but from their broad shoulders up they were consumed by flames. Or rather, they were the flames. As they turned toward him, Balvan could see faces within that fire.
"Are you Ifrits?"
he asked. But the flame people turned to flee, hurriedly tossing their tools into a golden-colored vessel. It resembled a tiny metal boat, but with a lid that sealed in the contents, their picks and shovels, as well as ore which they had been cutting from the wall.
"Wait, please,"
called the stone spirit, advancing slowly down into the room, fighting through the radiating, furnace-like heat. But they sealed the boat, and 3 of them shoved it into the magma. They forced its pointed prow through the viscous, molten mass. Then they themselves dove into the magma, as though swimming into thick mud. Their flames merged with the flow, and each of them sunk in until their bodies and feet disappeared, leaving Balvan alone with the broken wall they had been mining. He struggled not to despair. Instead, he recalled how the 3-armed thing had lurked after retreating. Balvan could not see into the magma at all. Though it was but melted rock, the heat was too much for him. Nevertheless, he thought they may still be there. He looked around at the rubble, the chunks of debris they had been chipping from the wall. He could sense a short ways into the other walls, though his stone sight was still limited by the crushing heat. And so he reached into the rock, felt around for the metal they had been mining, and he pulled it, tore it out from the wall. Every bit that he could see broke through the rough-hewn surface, tumbling down to the ground. More than enough to fill their metal boat to the brim, and more pure than what they had harvested with their picks and shovels. Then he sat heavily on the ground, nearly overwhelmed by the heat. He did not sweat, for he was stone, but he knew that he could not remain in this space next to the magma for long. And so he sat, sideways, between the pile of ore and the molten wall. He was beginning to think he needed to stand and leave, else he might be overwhelmed, and he did not know what would happen to him if he became unable to move from the deathly heat, trapped in this oven. But then he saw a fiery face poking out of the magma, watching him, and a second one, a few feet further and higher up the flow.
I could pull out more of this if you cut a little further into the wall.
Balvan's voice surprised him, coming out hoarse and faint, but he continued,
Please help me find the city of brass, the Ifrit.
He trailed off, passing out of consciousness.
Never have I seen a mountain melt.
The strange voice roused Balvan. He did not feel good, but thankfully he was cool again, no longer suffering the heat, and he could properly feel the stone of his surroundings, much further and clearer than he had felt in days. He was in a small, hewn space, the same type of stone as the flame people had been mining, though if this place had contained any ore, it was completely gone. Before him hovered another being made of fire, its true shape unclear, both burning and solid, and adorned with all manner of accessories, jewels and gleaming metal.
Is this the city of brass? Are you an Ifrit?
This place? Great flames, no. But as for me, close enough. Ifrit will do.
The being paused, waiting for something.
Thank you for saving me, Ifrit, but I have something more to ask.
Yes, the Azers told me you needed help, and I've never seen a mountain way down here, so I thought I would see for myself. But I cannot take you to the Shining City, if that is what you wish to ask.
I was only looking for the city because a friend of mine, Vohoin, said he had found help there. My daughter is sick, and we think she will fade away without aid.
Your daughter, a spirit?
Balvan nodded.
Then show me through the astral.
Balvan gave the Ifrit a confused and defeated look.
Really? You cannot... Wow, okay. This child, she contains a piece of your spark.
It was more of a pebble.
Sure, whatever. With that, if you think of her, I should be able to find her.
The being grasped Balvan's wrist. It took him by surprise. He had the instinct to recoil, to pull his hand away from the flames, but it was too late, and to his surprise the fiery touch did not burn him. So instead, he tried to concentrate on Alice, remembering her simple joy and the garden where he had left her. Nothing seemed to happen. For a minute he sat there, the Ifrit holding his wrist, but then the fiery spirit spoke.
Child of earth and wind, that I did not expect.
Could you help her? If I made some kind of pact, could you save Alice?
The Ifrit released Balvan's arm.
A bargain with you would be very strong. If there was something else you wanted,
they began, though their heart was clearly not in the sales pitch.
But I and most of my kin cannot help with your daughter's problem. She may be unique in all the worlds. To reconcile those two sides of her would probably take one of the true jinns, for they are each of two elements. I am certain the Jinn of earth and air would be able to help, if only... But they're gone. Both of the counter-Jinns are missing, and if the Lords of Brass cannot find them, I am afraid they are beyond you or me.
The Ifrit healed Balvan's wounds, and granted him protection from the heat, long enough to get back up to the roots of the mountain. They said it was in exchange for that ore he had extracted for the Azers, but that felt like a flimsy excuse for an act of pity. Balvan trudged through the Underdark, gliding steadily upward, out of ideas. He reconsidered seeking the aid of Nemetov. He tried searching around her depths, looking for the edges of her creations. But even as he witnessed more of the scale and beauty of her works, he was humbled by them. After only about a day he turned back, returning to that spot where she had sculpted their meeting into the stone, near the roots of his mountain. Feeling that hidden scene, and the life-sized impression of the dragon there, he sighed. For great and wise though Nemetov was, her amazing structures were works of patience, planning, and dedication. They were not the kind of power that could grant life to the dying. So he ceased looking, and, following his stone, the roots of the mountain, he worked his way back up to the surface in a depressed haze. Rising through the darkness, he didn't give off the aura of strength that he usually did. More than once, as he emerged into a tunnel or other void, one creature or another attacked him as he moved by, but he did not even react, continuing his rise upward, back into the stone, as their blades or claws barely scratched him, simply glancing off his dense breastplate. Nothing they could do hurt more than the thought of returning to Zonda Analis again, without help, without hope. Balvan was gliding, virtually trudging up the last stretch, within the mountain proper, when he sensed that something was wrong. He changed course, emerging into a tunnel filled with the clang of metal on metal, and with anguished snarls. "Balvan!" called out one of the Nezumi, the community of rat-like people of the mountain. It was a cry of shock, anguish, and relief, and with that one word, the scene ground to a stop. There were 3 Nezumi in the tunnel, armed with daggers. Balvan recognized their faces, but did not remember their names. He did not recognize the 4th ball of fur, lying face down in a swelling pool of blood. The spear-armed drow elf standing between them turned to face the spirit, his long platinum hair and black cloak swirling regally behind him.
"Balvan! Just the mountain I came to see."
With a slight tilt of his head, he made a smug aside to the creatures he had been fighting.
"You can go."
The Nezumi looked furious and glanced at the body of their friend, but Balvan nodded to them, and they retreated down the tunnel. The elf grinned. Even had he known Balvan, it would have been hard to tell from the spirit's steady, stalwart face how truly, deeply, dangerously angry he was at this moment.
"I know you are strong, Millstone, but you've never faced someone like me.
2 silver, said Balvan flatly, having made no move. And those who knew him well would have caught a dangerous edge to his tone. His voice lacked any hint of the great patience he normally expressed.
"Of course," smiled the elf, a white crescent in his night-black visage. He took a couple steps forward, drawing coins from a pocket, and deftly, cleanly placed them on the ground, stacked perfectly one upon the other. Then he stepped back. "Everyone knows the cost." The stone floor rose up and enveloped the coins in an instant, which seemed to throw off the dark elf, who may have been planning some kind of attack or other trick around picking up the silver. But he quickly regained his shark-like smile and confident demeanor. "Then let us begin. But know that I am master of Class Eniv." As he named the drow martial art, his body blurred, and suddenly there were 6 of him spread out through the tunnel, each adopting a combat stance, a veritable phalanx of spears. Balvan began to walk forward, but
But even with his first step, short rocky projections shot out of the ground, encasing the feet of all 6 apparent enemies. Most of the illusions flickered, reacting in shock, and 4 of them blinked out, leaving empty rock craters. Balvan strode up to one of the remaining copies of the Master, driving his fist into the chest of the true figure with a force that broke his feet free of the stone trap and flung him against the wall. The remaining image, sturdier than the others, flopped around unrealistically, unable to properly mimic the convulsions of its caster with its feet still trapped. The dark elf was breathing raggedly up against the wall, one of his feet mangled from breaking free of the stone. Balvan stood over him. He would have towered over the 5-foot elf, even standing, saw the proud warrior's eyes go wide. But the spirit glanced over at the crumpled body of the rat person slain before he had arrived, and he was not satisfied. He was still angry even beyond the murder, beyond this murderer at his feet, anger that was boiling over, and so he reached down and grabbed the Tlasaniv Master by the shoulder. The drow stifled a cry as the one-handed grip clamped down. It may have broken the bone, and Balvan started walking. He had almost been home, where Zonda and Alice waited for him, but he turned and took another path, a different tunnel. He could not pass through stone while dragging the killer, so he trudged a much longer path through the caverns of the mountain that was him. To a great chasm he dragged the elf, who screamed, his already battered composure shattered, as Balvan leaped down the great fissure with the villain still in hand. For almost a minute they fell, Balvan taking his prisoner into both hands. When his feet struck the bottom, he moved stone out from beneath the elf's body in such a way as to slow him, avoiding an abrupt stop, though he still cried out as the wind was knocked out of him and his wounded foot and shoulder were painfully jostled. Dropping him back to a single clamped hand, Balvan dragged him out of the stone indentation, dragged him back towards the nearby drow outpost and mine, which still, after so many decades, seemed to be the source of so much trouble. The spirit paused once more when he reached the boundary, the underground edge of the mountain that was him. But it was only a brief pause, then he continued forward, his prisoner having gone limp, unconscious. Again he was striding forward into darkness and danger, without the massive strength with which he rarely feared anything when home. But this time it was not exploration, not desperation, not the desire to help the people he loved. This time it was just anger, of a sort he had rarely felt. "Kto called out a drow voice, from further than he could feel in the stone or see with his eyes. Balvan reached back and pulled the rectangular stone shield off his back, raising it for protection, still dragging an elf with his other hand. "Who goes there?" repeated the guard, in the common language of the tunnels, but another voice interjected.
"It's him, is Millstone."
The first guard doubted.
"He does not leave mountain."
"Look at him! Is it all made of stone?"
Balvan continued to advance, but as the shapes of the drow soldiers came into view, he lowered his shield. "If you wish to fight, it will cost you," he said, pulling his prisoner's leg up and forward, making the body more obvious.
"Femonieti,"
whispered the second guard to the first, in awe and fear. Balvan could see a crossbow being aimed at him, but he continued to advance anyway, and after several more tense steps, the guards lost their nerve, turned, and ran back to raise the alarm. By the time the spirit reached the next checkpoint, the drow had organized a defense with their usual efficiency. The tunnel to the silver mine was blocked by a spiked barricade made from the thick fungal wood that drow harvest. 4 crossbows were trained at him through pairs of high and low slits, and he could feel many feet moving around behind them.
"I am Centurion Vereshkov. This is territory of Drow Republic. Turn back, now!"
With his shield still raised, Balvan tossed the supposed Tlasaniv Master more than 20 feet to land in front of the spikes, like a rag doll. The impact appeared to rouse the elf, who began moaning. "Will you stop?" Balvan was unaccustomed to throwing insults and struggled to find a word. "Ones like this, from attacking me and the people of the mountain."
"We do not control such fools,"
said the Centurion indignantly, thrown off by the unexpected request.
"It is only fame-seekers, nobles, assassins, renegades. It is not under military orders."
Nothing happened. Balvan stood like a monolith in the tunnel, and the soldiers breathed quietly, as they were trained to do, but just a few feet before them the wounded elf moaned pathetically over his cracked shoulder and shattered foot. The tension was thicker than the barricade. Finally, Balvan spoke again.
Then I will take all of your silver.
He slid down into the floor, shield and all, before the shooters could be ordered to fire.
What do we do?
Asked one of the soldiers, terrified.
Try it,
ordered the centurion. As the shooters and the squads behind them looked around, attacks breaking through from different angles was always a risk, part of warfare in the Underdark. But most creatures made noise when tunneling nearby, and very rarely would the drow find themselves standing around, just waiting for an attack from any direction. They backed closer to the middle of the cavern, facing outward, looking all around the ground, walls, and ceiling.
Where is he? He said silver. Maybe he passed by, hid for a silver mine. It is our duty to protect the mine, berated the leader. Watch every angle!
Balvan dropped down from above, shield first, crushing a half-dozen of the soldiers packed in the middle of the space, toppling several more who were nearby. As he straightened up to his full height atop the thick stone slab, which lay on a pile of injured elves. Even the centurion faltered. Nearly a day after rescuing the Nezumi, Balvan emerged into the Garden of Three Skies. He was covered in cuts and scrapes, all around his armor, even some on his head. But as the trio he had saved, and many others gathered around, looking to thank, or to aid, or to comfort him, he said only,
"Please tell Alice and Zonda I am here. I will return to them very soon."
And any further questions fell away, as they saw the huge mound of silver coins he was pulling up through the ground on a sort of stone sledge. Several people ran off to the tunnels to do as he said, as he hauled the massive load, sliding it up the slopes to the Church of Pelor. If his wounds were serious, the spirit showed no sign of being slowed by them. I thought this was going to end with part 3, but when I recorded it, it turned out to be twice as long as each of the first two, so I ended up splitting it, to be completed in part 4. I'm only able to do this for a living because of the amazing support of all my Patreon patrons, especially the way too generous members of the organization. If you want to support Tales from my D&D campaign and other storytelling videos like this one, you can do so at patreon.com/demonac. But if you can't afford to chip in, or just don't feel like it, please like and share these videos with anyone you think might like them. Thanks for watching.